Hi everyone, welcome back to our 2023 Winging It project. We're in week 3 of our quilt. I will put a playlist at the top of the screen so that you can go back and watch week 1 and 2 and catch up. We're making a very different kind of panel this week and I just want to talk you through what's on my desk. So I've got a piece of striped fabric and these are quite wide stripes. These are 0.8 of a centimetre, so if you want to get something similar, that's what you need to look for. I've also got a piece of pink. I'm in two minds about using this, I have to be honest, because it's not my favourite colour and I might live to regret it, but I think I have seen pink and red used together before in projects, and although you don't often see it in design, I think it could work. We're going to pull everything together, hopefully with our embroidery. I'm going to trust it's going to work. I've got an offcut of my blue stripe, an offcut of pink, and I've found a random fabric out of my stash that I think is going to help to start to pull the colour scheme together. So it's got the pale blue in it that I'm using. It's also got a pink and a red. We've got that buttery yellow that I've been using as well, and we've got some white in there and some of the darker green. So it is just a scrap. This is all I have. I don't know how much it will feature, but I think it'll be nice to have little patches of this popping up here and there across the quilt. So that's my fabric that I'm working with. I've also got some rickrack. This is quite chunky rickrack and it's pink. I could use red or blue, but I quite like this and I think I want to try and pull in as many colour variations as possible. Then I've got a range of threads. I'm not sure what I'm going to use yet because we're going to be making it up as we go along as usual. So I've got a blue, which is anchor 130. I've got a yellow, which is anchor 298. My light green is anchor 255. My red is anchor 46. I've got some white this time, which is 001, and I'm bringing in a pink now, which is 025. So we may use all or just some, not sure yet. I've also got some pins and I've got my embroidery scissors and a fabric marker just because it's going to come in useful. We're going to start by doing some cutting. We're going to produce a patched piece today, and so we're going to learn how to use our cutting mat to cut accurately, and we're going to make a piece that is stitched together, so we're going to need to be fairly careful in our cutting. So I'm going to start with my blue stripe, which is going to be my biggest section, and I've just positioned it on my cutting mat, and you want it to be fairly substantial in size, at least as wide as the block that we're trying to create. This is just an offcut, so when I was cutting out my 20cm squares just to prepare for the project, this is a bit that didn't quite fit that was left over. So what I've identified is the edges that I've actually cut that are squared off. And what I want to do is line up those straight edges with the grid lines on my cutting mat. So I've got this thicker line down here where I've lined up my cut edge, and my top edge is also a squared off edge that I've cut and I've lined it up. So this is the edge that I've cut, this is the edge that I've cut, and I've lined up those edges with the thicker lines on my cutting mat. So I know that that is a right angle corner. I'm not sure about the other two edges, but I've got this side line and the top line all squared off. So I know that my piece is 20cm deep, and I'm going to use that to cut an 11cm piece. Now you could just measure it, but you can use your grid lines to help you. So each block here is 5cm. I need to count 2 5cm blocks and an extra centimetre. I've got a steel edge ruler here. I'm just checking that it's lined up down here and up here. I'm going to measure twice and cut once, so I'm just double checking my measurements there. So now when I take my rotary cutter across, I've cut a precisely 11cm wide piece, and it's really nice and square. I'm just going to double check the width just to make sure that that is straight, because I can't remember whether I cut that edge or not. I'm lining it up and it is square. So that's my piece cut. Now I've got my offcut of pink. I'm going to line up my square edges. So this is my cut edge and this is my cut edge. It's definitely 20cm deep. And this time I want to make a 0.5 centimetre, and this time I'm going to use my cutting ruler. Now each square on here is 0.5 centimetre. So if I count 7 centimetres, rather than lining up my ruler edge with the 7 centimetre line, I'm going to line up my first 0.5 centimetre marker with it, and that pushes the edge of the ruler into that 7th centimetre square. So now when I cut, my piece is going to be 6.5 centimetres wide, and that's what I want to do. So if you've got a cutting ruler and a cutting mat, as long as your measurements on them are the same, so if you're working in millimetres, both have to be in millimetres. If you're working in inches, both have to be in inches. As long as you've got a grid ruler and a grid mat, you can do all your measuring by counting and placing your ruler carefully. So that's how I've done it. So now I've cut my pieces, what I've done now is mark a 1 centimetre seam allowance on the wrong sides of the fabric. Now that matters on this blue stripe because there's a definite right and wrong side. Some stripes are the same both sides. This one is printed rather than woven. So I just need to make sure I'm doing it on the back. I've measured it with my ruler by lining up my 1 centimetre line with the edge of the fabric, and I've measured a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I've cut out a piece of blue floral fabric that's 6.5 centimetres as well, and I've put seam allowances on one side of the pink, one side of the blue, and both sides of my stripe fabric. They need to be on the wrong side because I need to be able to see this line to stitch it. Now you can machine this if you want to. If you have a sewing machine, you could just run it through the sewing machine. But I just want to show you that you don't have to have a sewing machine to make this quilt. I'm going to do this one by hand. I'm going to start by placing the right sides together as carefully as I possibly can. So I'm lining up the corners really carefully, lining up the edges so that they match. I'm just double checking on both sides. If one piece is slightly out, if you scratch the top of the piece, it will just move it ever so slightly. It's a good way of nudging fabric to get it totally lined up. So now I'm just going to pin it. Now in hindsight, I should have put these pins perpendicular to my stitching line, and that stops the puckering of fabric affecting your sewing. And because I pinned them along the line that I'm going to cut, it did mean that once I'd stitched, my pieces didn't quite line up anymore. It's not the end of the world, but just learn from my mistake. It's just habit. I'm not a quilter, as I keep saying, so we're just making this up as we go along. If you want a more accurate stitch line, put your pins perpendicular, so put them vertically down the fabric instead of horizontally. So I'm just lining up my floral piece now in the same way and pinning it again, just to secure it in place while I'm stitching. Just double checking that's all lined up. We have got quite generous seam allowances on this project, so it's not the end of the world if it's a millimetre or so out, but you don't want it to be really wonky. So now I'm ready to do a little bit of sewing. It's really easy. If you do have a machine, you just sew down the 2 seam allowances, but you can do this whole quilt without a sewing machine. I've got a Sharps needle here. This is just a utility needle. Sharps is the type of needle, not the brand. It's short, quite fine, and very pointy. That's why it's called a sharp. If I bring in one of my normal embroidery needles, you can see it's much finer and much shorter, and it's got a smaller eye, so my thread won't keep coming out. And we want a needle like this because we don't want to force a chunky needle through where we just want a fine seam. I've just got some normal sewing cotton here. This is just polyester thread. I'm just using what I've got handy. I've just knotted the end of it with a quilter's knot. I've made quite a chunky knot because I don't want it pulling through. I'm going to use my seam allowance line on both sides. So I'm going to keep checking backwards and forwards to make sure my stitching is going straight. I'm going to sew these together using a back stitch. So I've just gone through the fabric there. I'm going back to the knot and I'm coming forward 2 stitch lengths so that I'm now away from the end of that first stitch. So I'm going back to the end of that first stitch, rocking my needle forward 2 stitch lengths so that there's a gap again, and then I'm going back to the end of the previous stitch, and I'm just going to stitch all the way along that line in that way. If you're not sure about back stitch, I will put a tutorial at the top of the screen. It does take a little bit of time, but there's no rush. We're using this as quite a therapeutic project. Now you might be thinking that 11 and 6.5 and 6.5 don't make a 20cm block. So let me just try and explain how the maths is working here. On our 11cm block, we've taken away a centimetre from either side for the seam allowance. So that actually becomes a 9cm block, which means we've got 11 centimetres remaining. So we've cut 2 6.5cm blocks and we've taken a centimetre from each of them, and that takes them down to 5.5. And when we add 5.5 to 5.5, that makes 11, and so that is our remaining 11 centimetres, and that turns it into our 20cm block. So if we take away seam allowances, what we've actually got is 2 5.5cm pieces and a 9cm piece, and that does add up to 20. So just trust the process, trust the measurements, they do work. I'm just scooting along this line. It didn't take me that long, maybe 15 minutes to stitch them by hand. You can see already that the fabric has moved a little bit. I've tied off the end there and I'm just trimming off the excess. You can do this with an iron, but I haven't got my iron set up. So whether you've machine or hand sewn your seam, what you want to do is open it out on the back and flatten that seam. And you want to press those seams open. I will do it with an iron, but I'm just finger pressing for now, just to smooth that seam wide open, and that's going to help your block lie flat. When I turn it over, you can see it's actually a really secure join and very neat as well, apart from the fact that the panel has shifted slightly to the right. That's our first join that's been pieced together. So as long as you make sure your seam is open and flat on the back, you'll be fine. I'm going to repeat that process on the pink, and then we'll come back and look at the next stage. So here's my panel, pressed out the seams, and I've put in my seam allowance to save me somewhere I will lose my stitching. So you can see here that the edges don't line up, and they've all moved in the same direction, and that's because of the way I pinned it. So what I've done is just take that into account when I've put in my seam allowances. So I've looked at the widest part of the panel and taken my centimetre from that. So you can see on the bottom right of that blue piece, the seam allowance is going to be less, but when I piece my blocks together, as long as I follow that line, it won't change the shape of my block. So I need to just make sure that my block size is going to end up at 18 centimetres regardless of what is happening with the seam allowance. It's worth just checking your measurements at this stage to make sure that your block is going to be the right size, otherwise you'll get some strange joins. I've got some rickrack here, and rickrack is a kind of braid. It's a bit like ribbon. It's woven in this zigzag pattern. It looks like it should be stretchy, but it isn't, so it's fairly stable to work with. So what we're going to do is stitch on some rickrack across the centre. So I'm going to cut just enough to go across and overhang a little bit. I want to find my centre point. I'm just going to measure to 9 centimetres. I'm not going from the edge of the block, I'm going from my seam allowance marks because I know that they're squared off. So I'm just measuring 9 centimetres top and bottom. That's my halfway mark, and I'm just going to use those markers to place my rickrack. I'm not worried about the overhang at the moment. We'll trim it back once we've stitched it down. So I'm just going to pin it along the length. Now it's worth noting that if you pin end to end and then pin in the middle, you run the risk of not having flat rickrack. So pin it from left to right or right to left rather than end to end and then in the middle. I've just got a single strand of pink thread here, and what I want to do is just catch down the rickrack with some really tiny stitches. I want my needle just inside the last ridge on the rickrack. So I've come through both layers, and then I'm going to take my needle back down just through the backing fabric. So I've made a little anchoring stitch that goes over the edge of the rickrack, and that will just put a little tiny stitch in. I haven't matched my thread particularly well here. I'm not too worried about it because as long as I keep my stitches nice and even, it will look fine, but also I wanted you to be able to see it on camera. So it's not difficult to do this. It's a really simple stitch up through both layers, down through just the backing fabric. I'm just going to get rid of that pin because I've got a stitch in there to hold it down now. The pin's just going to keep hooking the thread and getting on my nerves. So we just make little stitches like this all the way along the length of the rickrack, and I'm going to go down both sides of So my rickrack's attached, and what I'm going to do now is add some stitching either side. I thought it would be nice to do something that was reminiscent of a floral border. You can do whatever stitching you like. I thought it'd be quite nice to do some little lazy daisies. This is another variation on chain stitch that we looked at when we made block 1. We looked at how to make chains of stitch, and we did some detached chain stitches. A lazy daisy uses chain stitches that are worked in a circle. So I've brought my thread up at the centre of my flower. You might be able to see that I've put some little dots on to mark where the centres of my flowers are going to be. I've brought my thread round to the right, and I'm going to take my needle back down where the thread came out and come out again about 1/2 centimetre away inside that loop, so just like we'd make a normal chain stitch. I'm going to then anchor that down by taking my needle just the other side. I'm just hopping over the loop, the thread of the loop, and taking my needle down there to hold that stitch in place. This is 2 strands of my Anchor 298 yellow. So now I'm going to turn my work a little bit, and I'm going to bring my needle up again right at the centre of my flower, so starting at the same point with every stitch. Loop it round again, take my needle back in and just come out at a slightly different angle so that I create a petal pointing in a different direction. And I'm going to make a little anchor stitch, once again just hopping over the top to hold that stitch in place. So turn my work again, come up in the centre of my flower, make a loop, take my needle back down at the centre and out again a little distance away, and then put in my anchor stitch, just hopping over the top of that loop. And I'm going to aim at 5. I end up just putting 4 in. I thought I was going to be okay with 4 petals, but I wasn't, so I went back in and added a 5th petal to this flower. So it's just a series of chain stitches, just worked around a circle basically, starting every stitch in the same spot. So I'm just going to finish off my thread on the back rather than having lots of trailing stitches all the way across the back of my work. I do intend to just mix up the colours, so I don't know when I'm next going to put a yellow in. I'm just knotting that thread ready for the next time I use it. So if I bring up my work closer to the camera, you can see I've got my little 4-petal daisy there. And what I thought might be nice is to add some leaves. So I've got my green thread here. It's my dark green, which is 258. And I'm just going to bring my needle up in that space, in that little V where 2 of the petals touch each other. And I'm going to make another detached chain stitch. So taking my needle back down at the same point where the thread came out. I'm going to make this slightly longer. So bring my needle out inside the loop and pull through. But this time I'm going to add a little stalk. So my anchor stitch is a little bit longer, and that makes my stitch look more pointy. And then I'm just going to fill in that leaf by coming back up inside the loop and making a straight stitch along the length of the loop of the detached chain, and that sort of fills it in and creates almost like a vein. So that's a little leaf. Now if you want to, you can add a centre into your flower. So I've got 2 strands of blue here, and I'm bringing it up at the centre of the flower. If you wanted to, you could put a bead on this, but I just want stitching. I'm going to show you a French knot. So I've brought the camera in a little bit closer. I'm going to hold my working thread and sit my needle on the thread. I do have a tutorial for French knots. I'll link it at the top of the screen. So I'm going to sit my needle across my thread and then take my thread over my needle twice so that the thread is spiraled around the needle. You should be holding your thread at tension, and if you've got it right, you should be able to move your needle up and down and it should just work freely. And I'm going to keep that taut all the time. Then I'm going to pull the point of my needle back and take it down just ever so slightly away from where the thread came up, just so that I'm catching some fabric. Keep hold of my working thread to keep it taut, and then pull my needle all the way through. Now keep hold of that working thread until the very last moment. Then when I let go, it's going to pull tight and form a really neat little knot at the centre of my flower to create a flower centre. Super cute. So I'm going to add lots of these all the way along both sides of my rickrack. So add in a sort of floral border, and then we'll come back and see the finished block. So here's my finished block for this week. It's far less busy than the other blocks we've made so far. And what we're going to try and do as we go through the making of our quilt is leave some areas of space. So because there's no stitching at the top and the bottom, it's going to create a little bit of space for your eye to rest, in contrast with all the more busy panels that we're going to create. If I bring it up close, you should be able to see the colours that I've used a little bit better. I've tried to keep it random, and I've tried to use this stitching to pull together some of the colours that I'm going to be using elsewhere in the quilt. So I've brought some red in, and the pink, and those blues, yellows and whites and greens that I've used elsewhere. I've trimmed the rickrack back as well, just to the edge of the block. It will be tied in when we stitch our panels together. Just another thing I've been doing as I've been going along is just numbering the panels in the corner, just in my heat erase pen, just so that I know which week is which, and that means that when we come to put our quilt together, it will be easier for me to direct you to which piece is which. So it might be worth just numbering the previous two pieces. So if you haven't done it already, week 1 was our scrappy flowers, and week 2 last week we made our kitchen window, so I've put a little number 2 there, and I've got a little shortbread tin left over from Christmas that I'm keeping all of these panels in until we're ready to join some of them together. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you have enjoyed making this block, please do give us a thumbs up. It really helps our channel and helps other people find our videos. Do share your work at hashtag FSH23quilt, and so that we can see all of these blocks in one place, you could also add hashtag FSH23quilt3. If you've enjoyed this, I will put a similar video down here, and I'll put a video up here that is best for you. If you'd like to subscribe, click on our logo down at the bottom here. It makes it really easy for you. And if you turn on notifications, you'll never miss an upload. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week. Happy crafting, and I'll see you next week. Bye.